Hi guys. Another week of analysis and poetry. I'm really excited to share with you another narrative poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Paul Revere's Ride. Hopefully you're enjoying that. A little bit different story, historical connections that we can make here with a familiar story. But I wanted to read with you an article about the actual historical inaccuracies that Henry Wadsworth Longfellow actually put into this poem. So I have an article. I'd like you to grab your own copy, either print or have it on your computer as I'm going to analyze it with you, just like we would in class. We would stop and talk and analyze it and annotate together. And then I have just a few questions for you to answer on the article as well. Okay, so let me share my screen and we will get started in this analysis together. Okay, so this article I actually found on Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's page, and this is narrative poetry background on Longfellow's Paul Revere's Ride. And you noticed in the video that it was also called The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. So sometimes the titles of poems change. This is a really old poem, as you'll see, but we're talking about the same poem here. Hopefully you liked the story and the musicality of this poem, as well as there's the end rhyme and all of the alliteration that was used and the imagery, some of the things that we're going to be talking about tomorrow. Okay, so here we go. Narrative poetry, background on Longfellow's Paul Revere's Ride. Paul Revere's Ride, written in 1860, is a poem by American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow that commemorates the actions of the American patriot Paul Revere on April 18th, 1775. And you know that that's the setting of the story. And this is during the Revolutionary War. Although with significant inaccuracies. Well, what does that mean? Something that's inaccurate. So it's not historically correct. It was first published in the January 1861 issue of the Atlantic Monthly. It was later retitled The Landlord's Tale in the collection Tales of a Wayside Inn. This poem is spoken by the landlord of the Wayside Inn and tells a partly fictionalized story of Paul Revere. So partly fictionalized, partly not true, right? And so here, this article is really going to tell us, what are these inaccuracies? What are these things that in history are not true? In the poem, Revere tells a friend to prepare signal lanterns in the Old North Church to inform him if the British will attack by land or sea. And there's that famous line in the poem, one if by land, two if by sea. And so this is that famous story that most of you have heard before. You know that Paul Revere and his unnamed friend are the two characters in the story. He would await the signal across the river in Charlestown and be ready to spread the alarm throughout Middlesex County, Massachusetts. The unnamed friend climbs up the steeple and soon sets up two signal lanterns, informing Revere that the British are coming by sea. Revere rides his horse through Medford, Lexington, and Concord to warn the Patriots. And so this is kind of how the plot is moving. He's given the lantern, that climactic part where he's looking at the lights. He jumps on his horse. The following action being that he's riding through Medford and Lexington and Concord, and then, of course, the resolution. When the poem was written in 1860, America was on the verge of civil war. Okay, so thinking about it, this is the whole background of why Longfellow's writing this story. He's writing it during the Civil War, reminding the Americans what happened during the Revolutionary War, okay? Longfellow first came forward publicly as an abolitionist in 1842 with the publication of poems on slavery. Though he admitted the book made a little impact, it was written for his best friend, Charles Sumner, an activist, abolitionist politician with whom he could continue to share common cause on the issues of slavery and the Union. Paul Revere's Ride was published in January of 1861, an issue of Atlantic magazine on December 20th, 1860, just as South Carolina became the first state to secede from the United States. The poem was meant to appeal to the Northerners' sense of urgency and as a call for action, noting that history favors the courageous. So that's his author's purpose here. He is meaning to remind the North what it is that they did that made them so courageous in the Revolutionary War here now in the Civil War. So this is his purpose here. Longfellow, who often used poetry to remind readers of cultural and moral values, warns at the end of the poem of a coming, quote, hour of darkness and peril and need, implying the breakup of the Union, and suggests that the people will awaken and listen to hear the midnight message again. By emphasizing common history, he's attempting to dissolve social tensions. So his purpose here is to remind the North what they did and how they were courageous during the Revolution, to bring them back to the same courageousness and action in now the Civil War. The phrase "hardly a man is now alive" was true, as one of the last men alive at the time had only recently died. Jonathan Harrington, the young fifer for Lexington's militia during the battles of Lexington and Concord, died at the age of 96 in 1854, a few years before the poem was written. The poem fluctuates between past and present tense, sometimes in the same sentence, symbolically pulling the actions of the Revolution into modern times and displaying an event with timeless sympathies. Longfellow's poem is not historically accurate, but his mistakes were deliberate. So here's going to describe how the mistakes that he made, he did it for a purpose. He had researched the historical event using works like George Bancroft's History of the United States, but he manipulated the facts for poetic effect. He was purposefully trying to create an American legend. So he made changes to purposefully create an American legend, as much as he did with the works like the Song of Hiawatha and the Courtship of Miles Standish. Modern critics of the poem emphasize its many historical inaccuracies. For example, the poem depicts the lantern signal in the Old North Church as meant for Revere, but actually the signal was from him. So it was him who was in the church for truth, right? When he was actually the one in true history up in the church doing the signal of the lantern, the poem depicts that he's the rider waiting to receive the lantern light. The historical Paul Revere did not receive the lantern signal, but actually was the one who ordered it to be set up. The poem also depicts Revere rowing himself across the Charles River, when in reality, he was rowed over by others. He did not reach Concord that night. Another inaccuracy is a general lengthening of the time frame of the night's events. So he didn't really actually get all the way there. He was not successful, as in the poem, and the length of time that happened was not correct as well. The majority of criticism, however, notes that Longfellow gave sole credit to Revere, so he was the only writer. This is actually not true. This is probably the most important part of the historical inaccuracy, is the fact that there were actually 3 major people involved. Longfellow gave sole credit to Revere for the collective achievements of 3 writers, as well as other writers whose names do not survive to history. In fact, Revere and William Dawes rode via different routes from Boston to Lexington to warn John Hancock and Samuel Adams that the British soldiers were marching from Boston to Lexington to arrest Hancock and Adams and seize the weapons stores in Concord. Revere and Dawes rode toward Concord, where the militia's arsenal was hidden. They were joined by Samuel Prescott, a doctor who lived in Concord and happened to be in Lexington. So the 3 riders were Revere, Dawes, and Prescott. They were stopped by British troops in Lincoln on the road to Concord. Prescott and Dawes escaped, but Revere was detained and questioned and then escorted at gunpoint by 3 British officers back to Lexington. So one huge, major inaccuracy was that Revere never made it. He never made it. He was detained and taken back to Lexington. So here, Revere wanted to make this American legend, and so he chose Revere as the single writer, and he says in the poem that he was successful, where in fact in history, Revere was not successful. He never made it, and there were 3 writers, Revere, Dawes, and Prescott. Of the 3 writers, only Prescott arrived at Concord in time to warn the militia there. So my question to Longfellow would be, why didn't you use Prescott in the story? Why use Revere? So that would be a question I would like to ask him. Longfellow's poem is credited with creating the National's legend of Paul Revere, a previously little-known Massachusetts silversmith. For a long time, historians of the American Revolution, as well as textbook writers, relied almost entirely on Longfellow's poem as historical evidence. Well, that's a problem. We just said that it had mistakes, it was historically inaccurate, but they relied on it because it was easily attainable. So, creating substantial misconceptions in the minds of the American people. Misconceptions, wrong ideas. So this is the background and historical information of the narrative, Paul Revere's Ride. I hope that you enjoy it as much as I do. Okay, so now that you have read that and analyzed it with me, now you're going to go to the questions that I have for you. Okay, so just to review, make sure that you highlight your answers or change the color of your answers to red. This is a direction, it's easier for submission. So you're going to answer these 6 questions, making sure that you answer each one. Please follow the directions. During which war did Longfellow write the poem? And then second, during which war does the setting take place? So he wrote it during one war, and it is written about and during in the setting of another war. What was his purpose? We just discussed what his purpose was. Why did he make these purposeful mistakes? Describe 3 of those important historical inaccuracies, and then tell me what does this create in the minds of Americans? So just the basic information, okay? All right, reach out to me if you have any questions.